It's wearing a lot of people out. I'm glad it's not as bad as that. We are in Deuteronomy 29. We really are getting close to the end of this, I promise. Yes, I know. Thank you, Sam. Sid, how about leading us in a word of prayer, sir?
Father in heaven, thankful for time today and have a dear study of word, worship, pray that share minds and open up our hearts. And then always live according to your word. We pray, Father, that you will bless those that are going to stand in your kingdom. Thank you for the answer prayer. Thank you for us, Father. Pray you give us our sin.
Okay, we are in Deuteronomy 29, and as I mentioned, we actually can see the horizon of the end from here. Now, that doesn't mean that today we will get there, but you never know. Stranger things have happened, right? This is his last time with Israel. By the time we get to chapter 32, we are basically, or 33, we are basically recording his final blessing and the close of his story. And to this point, I guess you could say he's replicating what originally happened at Sinai with that original generation. Now, had they obeyed the command of God and entered Canaan when they were told to, all of this would have been, quite honestly, unnecessary. God knew they weren't going to do it. He'd already, our future does not surprise God. Let's put it that way. And so we've spent 40 years in the wilderness wandering between the book of Exodus and beginning of Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is basically Moses reestablishing the covenant, God's statutes, his commands with this new generation. The former generation has passed away. Everybody 40 and above at Sinai, all the males have passed. And now you've got a brand new crop of fighting men in Israel, and they're getting ready to cross the Jordan. And before they do, Moses was basically commanded by God to reestablish this covenant. And by the time you get to chapter 29, he's beginning to summarize. And so open with verse 1 of chapter 29. He says, "These are the words of the covenant which the Lord commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant which he made with them in Horeb." And so Deuteronomy is a recap of so much of the material that we found in Leviticus and starting in Exodus and then Leviticus and then Numbers. This is all put together in one compact book. And by the time you get down to, look at verse 21 just for a second. He talks about this book of the law. It seems that what Moses expects to be, what God expects to be read regularly and copied down, all of those types of things, is the book of Deuteronomy. Doesn't mean the rest of the Pentateuch is unimportant, but the book of Deuteronomy puts it all together in one package. There is some extra material in the earlier books, but Deuteronomy is his primary focus when he's talking about this. Verse 2. He says, "Now Moses called all Israel and said to them, 'You have seen that all that the Lord did before your eyes in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh, to all his servants, to all his land, the great trials which your eyes have seen, the signs, and those great wonders.'" Not everybody who's standing there saw those visibly. You've got this whole new generation and all of those that have been born in the last 40 years. They didn't see it personally. They see it through the words of Moses, through the words of their elders and their forefathers. And so they've seen it through the words of their testimony, even if they didn't pass through the Red Sea and do those great things. And so they're just as familiar with it if the people have been faithful. We know Moses has been faithful. And so they're very familiar with it, even if they weren't yet alive to see it visibly. Verse 4, it says, "Yet the Lord has not given you a heart to perceive, eyes to see, and ears to hear to this very day." You've seen it, you know about it, but you don't fully comprehend it or understand what's going on. "I have led you," verse 5, 40 years in the wilderness. "Your clothes have not worn out on you. Your sandals have not worn out on your feet. You've not eaten bread, nor have you drunk wine or similar drink, that you may know that I am the Lord your God." They didn't have access to vineyards. They didn't have access to all the comforts of home. They were basically RVing. No, they were tent camping, weren't they? They weren't even RVing, so they weren't glamping. They were tent camping for these 40 years. Let's see, when you came to this place, so right now they're on the east side of the Jordan. Using my air map, they're on the east side of the Jordan. Soon they'll be crossing the Jordan just outside the town of Jericho. And so this is their staging area, preparing to cross the Jordan. When you came to this place, verse 7, "Sihon, the king of Heshbon, Og, the king of Bashan, came out against us to battle. We conquered them. We took their land and gave it as an inheritance to the Reubenites, the Gadites, to half the tribe of Manasseh. Therefore keep the words of this covenant and do them, that you may prosper in all that you do. All of you stand today before the Lord your God, your leaders, your tribes, your elders, your officers, all the men of Israel, your little ones and your wives, also the stranger who's in your camp, from the one who cuts your wood to the one who draws your water, that you may enter into covenant with the Lord your God, into his oath, which the Lord your God makes with you today, that he may establish you today as a people for himself, that he may be God to you, just as he has spoken to you, and just as he has sworn to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I make this covenant and this oath not with you alone, but with him who stands here with us today before the Lord our God, as well as with him who is not here with us today." So it's not just the males of Israel, but it's all the people that make up the numbers, including Gentiles or others. Let's see. Oh, verse 16. "For you know that we dwelt in the land of Egypt, that we came through the nations which you passed by. You saw their abominations, their idols which were among them, wood and stone and silver and gold, so that there may not be among you man or woman or family or tribe whose hearts turn away today from the Lord our God to go and serve the gods of these nations, that there may not be among you a root bearing bitterness or wormwood. And so it may happen, when he hears the words of this curse, that he blesses himself in his heart, saying, I shall have peace, even though I follow the dictates of my heart, as though the drunkard could be included with the sober. The Lord would not spare him, for then the anger of the Lord and his jealousy would burn against that man. Every curse that is written in this book would settle on him. The Lord would blot out his name from under heaven, and the Lord would separate him from all the tribes of Israel for adversity, according to all the curses of the covenant that are written in this book of the law, so that the coming generation of your children who rise up after you, the foreigner who comes from a far land, would say when they see the plagues of that land and the sicknesses that the Lord has laid on it. Basically, he's going back over and reapplying these curses, and it's primarily focused on Israel's temptation and yielding to the temptation of idolatry, worshiping, serving, and obeying the gods who aren't gods. And he goes back to that time and again. And he says God's not going to overlook it. He's not going to ignore it. He is going to be faithful, and he will bring forth his curses because they are a part of the covenant. Look at verse 25. When people saw the evidence of God's punishment and God's wrath, he said, why has he done this? And people would say, because they have forgotten the covenant of the Lord God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. For they went and served other gods and worshipped them, gods that they did not know, that he had not given to them. Then the anger of the Lord was aroused against this land. Keep in mind, it's not just the person who will be punished. Multiple times when God warns them against idolatry and pursuing after other gods and imitating their abominable behavior, he talks about how the land would vomit them out. The consequence isn't just on the individual. It goes beyond that. And if there's one thing that both Deuteronomy, well, the Pentateuch, but also Joshua makes clear, is even when it's just one man who sins, and I'm thinking specifically about that first mistake in Joshua, even when it's just one man who sins, there's a fallout. The ripples of sin affect and impact far beyond just that individual. And that's part of what he's bringing out here. He says they went and served other gods. They did the things God has told them time and time and time again. Don't do this. He will pour out his wrath on the land. Verse 28, the Lord uprooted them from their land in anger, in wrath, in great indignation, and cast them into another land as it is this day. The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but those things which are revealed belong to us, to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law. And time again, he's going to be reinforcing that. Good. Yes, sir.
And that he may be God to you.
Right.
Okay. A lot of times I have thoughts about this free will and the difference between having to and being free to do it.
Good.
Okay, and so he's speaking to me in such a way where the word is made.
Right.
Okay, not have to, not law. And it's talking about the intention, though, of the law is that we come to see that we may have this relationship with our God and that he has a desire to be our God.
Yes,
Okay.
that is a consistent thing.
He wants to be our God. It doesn't mean that people will necessarily embrace that. As a matter of fact, as you get into chapters 30 and following, you find God knows exactly what their future holds in store. They're not going to surprise him. It doesn't change the fact that God really doesn't want to punish them. He wants to keep them in a genuine relationship with him.
I don't know, the thought came to me is that God goes, this is my perfect will. And I have given you the ability to reciprocate with a perfect will.
Right?
That is to choose me as your God.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes. And in fact,
He's going to put it almost in those exact words, just about a chapter in front of us. So I'm glad you're already there. Start chapter 30. It says, it shall come to pass when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse, which I've set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God drives you. You see how he's wording this. He said, yes, I know what you're going to do. I know what I'm going to have to do because of my holiness, and you are going to experience times of exile, especially talking about very likely the Babylonian exile. It says, you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God drives you, and you return to the Lord your God and obey his voice according to all that I command you today, you and your children, with all your heart, with all your soul, that the Lord your God will bring you back from captivity, have compassion on you, and gather you again from all the nations where the Lord your God has scattered you. And he goes on to describe wherever you've been scattered, God will bring you back when you turn back to him and begin to embrace again his covenant. Bless you, Julia. Verse 6. The Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, that you may live. Right? This goes back to that relationship, right? It's not a relationship primarily of fear and forced obedience. God wants a relationship that reflects His relationship. And time and again, He reminds them, the reason you're here is because I set my heart on you. I set my will on you. I purposed you from the beginning, and it's because I loved you. And what He desires is a reciprocated love on the part of His people. Love will reveal itself or lead to obedience and faithfulness and an exclusiveness to belong only to God. But He wants that genuine reflection of what He's poured out on them. He wants that back. That's our best. Doug, did you move your hand? Got to be careful with that. Somebody did. Okay. Let's see. Okay, here's the choice I was talking about, Ray. Look at verse 11. For this commandment which I command you today is not too mysterious for you, nor is it far off. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend into heaven for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. Nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. It's not one of those things that demands this tremendous odyssey, this journey like, what was it? Hercules was given these multiple, what were they called? Well, he was supposed to carry out these, there's a word for it though. He was supposed to go and find this and conquer this creature and do. Anyway, God's saying, that's not what this is not going to require some superhuman effort on your part. I'm already giving it to you. It's already here. And Moses, by his repetition all the way through Deuteronomy, the people should have had burned into their hearts many of the precepts that he has just hit and hit and hit, especially precepts of the Ten Commandments and the precepts of don't commit idolatry. Gee, they sound. Anyway, he said, you know this, verse 14, the word is very near you, in your mouth, in your heart, that you may do it. And here's this duality. See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. In that I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in His ways, to keep His commandments, His statutes, His judgments, that you may live and multiply. And the Lord your God will bless you in the land which you go to possess. But if your heart turns away so that you do not hear and are drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, I announce to you today that you shall surely perish. Shall not prolong your days in the land which you cross over the Jordan to go in and possess. I call heaven and earth as witnesses today against you, that I've set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life. That's what you were talking about, right? Therefore literally be choosing life, that both you and your descendants may live, that you may love the Lord your God, that you may obey His voice, that you may cling to Him, for He is your life and the length of your days, that you may dwell in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them. Flip over to a familiar little sermon in the book of Matthew right quick. And you'll see you've got this same thought process going. Matthew chapter 7. Jesus is genuinely taking up Moses' instructions, Moses' utterance of the Word of God, and applying it still today. Matthew chapter 7, verse 13. Enter by the what? The narrow gate. For wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leads to destruction. There are many who go in by it. Because narrow is the gate, And difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it. Two choices. It's not a smorgasbord. It's one or the other. Life and blessing, death and cursing. And that's true whether you're in the old covenant with God's laying it out by statute and design, or whether you're in the new covenant established by Jesus. We still make that same choice. Galatians talks about God will not be mocked. Whatever man sows, that he'll reap. Same thought. Two choices. You build on the rock, you build on the sand. You enter by the narrow gate, or you follow the crowds and wind up in the wide gate. Two choices, two very different ends. Let's see. Where did I leave off? Go back to Deuteronomy. I don't think we've got to read all of this. Let's at least read 31:1. It says, Moses went and spoke these words to all Israel. And he said to them, I'm 120 years old today. I can no longer go out and come in. And the Lord has said to me, you shall not cross over this Jordan. The Lord your God himself crosses over before you. He will destroy these nations from before you. You shall dispossess them. Joshua himself crosses over before you, just as the Lord has said. Look at verse 6. Be strong and of good courage. This one gets repeated more than once in Deuteronomy, as well as in the beginning of Joshua. Be strong and of good courage. Do not fear nor be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, he is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. And Moses called Joshua and said to him in the sight of all Israel, be strong and of good courage. Saying it again, you must go with this people to the land which the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give them. You shall cause them to inherit it. And the Lord, he is the one who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Do not fear nor be dismayed. Well, we just have to keep reading. Any comments, let me know. Tommy?
Gathering up the time element of this.
Okay.
Is he, I know he wrote this down and we have the book.
Mm-hmm.
How did he get, was this a sermon? Was this I don't, he had to have time to write it down.
Yes, as a matter of fact,
Verse 9 says that very thing. To this point, he hasn't written it. He's been preaching it, proclaiming it in the hearing of Israel.
He didn't have a microphone.
Right.
How did he get it out to all the people?
we assume he's up on, it's not Mount
Ebal. What mountain is this? Horeb? He's probably up on an elevated, right. At some points, he's got all Israel together. At other points, he's going to call the elders together. Verse 9, he's talking to the priests and the Levites. Let's see, but
My thinking is not going out to all the people. He's preaching this to the leaders. The leaders take it to the underlings, on down to the people.
It doesn't seem to be.
there are several points in here where it says all people, all the people. And so, if nothing else, I figure God is able to amplify the signal well enough for everybody to hear, because it does, based on the way it at times interjects narrative or description. It does seem that the bulk of this is being delivered to all the people at once. And yet he does speak about some that aren't here. I don't know, we read it somewhere. As well as with him who is not here with us today. So there may be some missing. There may be some out in the camp doing whatever. But the bulk of the people are there. And he's speaking to basically all of them. Not just the elders. Except in those sections where it says he he assembles. But for instance, in verse 20, chapter 31, verse 30, it says, Moses spoke in the hearing of all the assembly of Israel. So he's going to proclaim the song of Moses, and he's going to proclaim that the way it's written to all the people of Israel. So I don't see it as something where he's just giving the leaders and passing it on. It sounds like he's delivering this to the bulk of the people. Maybe not every single person, but the bulk of the people are there. And how they cover all of that, if we are dealing with 2 million people plus, I can only attribute that to God. Lawrence?
Well, it was necessary that he first speak all these instructions himself to the people.
Right.
So that it would validate the scripture that he later wrote down as being what he said.
True. And the other
Part of it is he is doing the same thing he did in at Sinai with that first generation. And there, the bulk of that is delivered to all the people. They heard the 10 Commandments from the top of the mountain. They heard all of these things. It wasn't just a select representative group and then they'll go and trickle it down. That seems to be the case of Deuteronomy. It's a replication. He's repeating the entire covenant experience for this new generation to show that God's still providing the same offers if you will respond and follow his lead. This new generation is far from perfect, but when he tells them cross the Jordan, this one crosses the Jordan. The first generation did not. And so they're at least faithful in that main thought. And they are faithful for the most part as they go and wage war against the cities. So this generation is a good replacement generation.
I think that Moses' voice was, excuse me, at least as strong as Charlton Heston's. Yeah.
Obviously. Well, I thought he was Charlton Heston.
Still, talking about later when he goes up to the mountain to be buried, God says, his natural force was not abated.
Yes.
He was still 100% strength.
I have no question about that. But it is kind of hard to imagine using just natural abilities how you'd communicate with a couple of million people at one time, unless God is, in some sense, amplifying it. Kind of like when he gets up on the mountain and God lets him see the entire promised land. I realize that promised land from where the mountain is to the sea is only less than 200 miles, but still that's a long way to see unless God caused a supernatural ability for him to be able to see the promised land, because it sounds like he gets to see all of it. I figure it's a divine drone kind of situation. But that's a good question. And as far as the time frame, this is a very short time frame. The entirety of the book of Deuteronomy is probably no more than a matter of weeks at the most. And it may be all done in a single week. Some would say maybe even a single setting. Now, if you think preach a long time, think about that one, Ray?
This is a coincidence, but I've always been curious about seeing the horizon.
about what?
Seeing the horizon, I've always heard it's 10 miles to the horizon.
Okay.
I was riding with my son, and of course we see a lot of flat property, and so I got curious and got on the phone, and I went, is it 10 miles? What I discovered was it's 10 miles once you've raised yourself from the surface. And that as you stand and see it, it's much further.
Yes, it is.
And if you're elevated on a mountain, he could have possibly seen across.
I can tell you that flying at 4,000 or 5,000 feet, you can see an incredibly long distance. Whether you could see 200 miles, I don't know, but the higher you get, the farther you can see, there's no question.
From surface to me standing up, it's at 30 miles. That's why I say if you go up a mountain, that it probably was possible for him to see across that distance.
It is possible. Now, how he'd be able to see the northern tip and the southern tip, we'll guess on that one. But you'd still just be seeing it at a distance. But, yes, it does. Mama Lou, you moved your hands. You got to be careful with that. Okay, good. Doug?
You're talking about Joshua, be strong and good courage. Again, he was only one of 3 people that were living at that time that had seen it all.
Yes.
Him, Caleb, and Moses. And he had the benefit of seeing the plagues in Egypt, seeing all the events at Mount Sinai, the crossing of the Red Sea, all of that. So he had all the information. Moses was encouraging to use that and his dependence on God to be the right leader that he would be.
Right.
To step up to what he's being called to do. And lest we forget, there would be women alive. We talk about these are the only 3 men that were alive, still alive, that would have seen these things firsthand in Egypt. But it says nothing about the women. So there are women in the congregation that they've seen all this too. Mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers probably by this time, I'm just assuming. But you've only got 3 men alive who've seen those events, and one of those is about to die. Look at verse 9. This goes back to what Tommy was talking about. Moses, to this point, has delivered this orally. He's delivered it verbally. He expects the people to hear, to heed, to remember, and to share. But he also takes and writes it out. Verse 9. Moses wrote this law, delivered it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. And Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, at the appointed time in the year of release, at the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God, in the place which he chooses, you shall read this law before Israel, all Israel in their hearing. Now, next time you get a little restless about that we're taking forever to study Deuteronomy, we're not doing it every 7 years. And they were supposed to sit and listen to it in one sitting. That's kind of challenging. Yes, sir?
Papa Tom's question.
Okay.
Between the 2 chapters here, he's speaking at, this is what he was alluding to.
Right.
Time had to elapse for him to write it down and start in verse 14, right?
Right.
Okay. Does the reading of this, the whole book, is it altered the time frame? Do we know that it's chronological or these are snippets? Like where we know he obviously, time had to elapse.
Right.
Okay? Where do we put that?
The writing part of it?
I put it right before his death. As I understand it, he's spoken all these words. Now he sits down and records a written record of it. And that's why I try and allow that Deuteronomy could take a period of a couple of weeks, or it could happen, right in very, very small slice of time. And the reason I do that, one says, okay, there seems to almost be required at least a small lapse of time for him to deliver all of this, record it, then deliver it to the Levites, to the priests, and charge them with what they're supposed to do with it. And yet, time and again, during what he's delivered up to this point, time and again, he'll talk about this day as if it's his last day of life. And so if you take his words literally, he's doing all of this in a 24-hour period. I see that as unlikely, but I don't want to say that it couldn't have happened. Maybe he's just a really fast writer. I never was. It would take me much longer to write this entire book, which if I was going to be a king, I would be expected to write this entire book, right? Sit down, copy it, make your own copy, and have that for you to meditate with it. That was part of his instruction to the kings. So it's difficult to say this is exactly the amount of time. Depends on how literally you want to press those statements when he talks about this day, or whether we can allow that maybe he was talking about it in a more general sense, in which case we could allow for a couple of weeks.
I mean, it's probably not important, but a lot of times we take our education on things that are said to us outside of the study group.
Mhm.
And it's always been Moses was 120 years old.
Right.
It becomes important because you hear it for 70 years. And it's the only reason I'm asking the question is I never thought about it before, but why is 120 so important? Because these kind of scriptures could defy that and say, he might have been 121. You follow me?
Okay.
Okay. But if you carry that type of information, and if that information was important when you were young, you have to take time to go, wait, let's clean some webs off of this stuff.
Okay.
You follow me?
Yeah.
And so the importance of the question is more about that, in my opinion, than it is about the accuracy, whether he was 119 or 121.
I would agree with that. I'm just going to say I can see that, and that's not the main point of the material anyway, right? That's dealing more with trying to be specific. Okay, we can allow. It's kind of like Jesus was going to be in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights. Okay, was he there 72 hours? Not as far. Some will be so. They will make such an effort to say, well, he said 3 days and 3 nights, so it's got to be 72 hours, and so they'll actually put the crucifixion on Thursday. Sorry, that's not how I read the text at all. It was a portion of the first day and a portion of the third day, and in the Jewish way of reckoning, that's 3 days, 3 nights. And that aligns with the scripture as it's recorded, rather than me trying to come up with an ingenious suggestion to make it fit my 21st century Western concept of 3 days, 3 nights. So, is it 120 exactly? We know that's the ballpark where he is. So, it could be 119 and a half or 120 and 11 months. Like the kids say, I'm 6 and 11 months. Yeah, when you get to be my age, that's not a part important. Okay. That answer that question? More of a comment. Okay. Good.
Our attitudes lend to understanding.
Yes.
Okay, and that's some of the things that we carry with us in here sometimes. And I'm 70 years old, and I keep reminding you how I was raised.
Yeah.
And so there's stuff sprinkled all over me I need to shed.
I like the dust off the cobwebs idea. And this summer has been a summer of cobwebs, in case you didn't notice it. Okay, look at verse. Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, at the appointed time in the year of release, at the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Gather the people together, men and women and little ones, the stranger who's within your gates, that they may hear and that they may learn to fear the Lord your God, and carefully observe the words that their children who have the Lord your God, as long as you live in the land which you cross the Jordan to possess. Let's see. Okay, he's going to inaugurate Joshua, continue to charge him Well, here, jump up to verse 16. Deuteronomy 31, verse 16 and following. The Lord said to Moses, Behold, you will rest with your fathers, and this people will rise and play the harlot with the gods of the foreigners of the land, where they go to be among them. They will forsake me, break my covenant which I've made with them. Then my anger shall be aroused against them in that day, and I will forsake them. I will hide my face from them, and they shall be devoured. Many evils and troubles shall befall them, so that they will say in that day, Have not these evil come upon us, because our God is not among us? And I will surely hide my face in that day because of all the evil which they have done, in that they've turned to other gods. And you look at the book of Judges, and you find out that it happens there, at least to a certain level. And then you look at the Babylonian exile, and that's where it happens on a massive level. Verse 19, he says, Now therefore write down this song for yourselves. And so he begins to lay the groundwork for chapter 32. And chapter 32 was to be given to Israel as a memorized song, so that they would teach it to one another, they would teach it to their children. It was to be something they could immediately call to mind that would, in capsuled form, relate from the beginning to the experience. Where does he talk about it? To the point where they're in a foreign land. Well, we'll probably find it whenever we get there, and the song will even include the reference to the Gentiles and their future joy with the people of Israel, something that's picked up and quoted in the New Testament. Chapter 31, verse 22, Therefore Moses wrote this song the same day and taught it to the children of Israel. He's going to inaugurate Joshua, but this is really where we need to stop. So Lord willing, next week we can go over the song of Moses and then see how close we can get to finishing the book. But again, the horizon is in sight.